The morning air carried a sharp bite, sweeping through the valley like a warning no one had asked for. Jack Ward pulled back on the reins, his gray eyes narrowing at the shape of the old cabin that had once belonged to his uncle. For a split second, he thought maybe he was seeing wrong, that his mind was playing tricks after too many miles on the trail. But no. 5 women hung from ropes strung up on the front gate, their bodies swaying against the cold wind. Their torn dresses whipped like flags of surrender, their bare feet shifting gently with each gust. A rough wooden plank was nailed across one of the posts, words burned into it with a knife, plain as day in the faint light. This land is Morrison's. Always has been, always will be. Jack's throat went dry. This land was supposed to be his new beginning, a chance at peace after years of war and wandering. What greeted him instead was a scene ripped out of hell itself. His horse shifted uneasily, snorting as if it, too, could feel the weight of death in the air. Jack swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into the frozen ground. He stepped closer, one hand lifting almost against his will, fingers brushing against the neck of the nearest woman. To his shock, a faint throb pulsed beneath her skin. He quickly moved from one to the next, another heartbeat, another weak breath. They were alive, barely, hanging on by threads. Something in him shifted then. This wasn't just about inheriting land. It was a fight someone had already started, and cutting those ropes would drag him right into the middle of it. He knew it could swallow him whole, maybe even cost his life. But he didn't hesitate. The blade flashed in his hand as he slashed through the first rope. The woman dropped like a sack, but Jack caught her before she hit the ground. Her neck was raw from the noose, her breath shallow, but she clung to life. One by one he cut them down, lowering each carefully to the frozen dirt until all 5 lay in a row. Their skin was cold, their bodies stiff, but he could see flickers of life, fluttering eyelids, weak groans slipping out against the silence. Jack crouched and freed their wrists and ankles from the rough bindings. His stomach twisted at the sight of the bruises and cuts carved into them. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted them gone. They'd wanted to make them suffer, to turn them into a message for anyone fool enough to claim this patch of land. He dragged them under the cabin's awning, clearing space inside the dust-choked room. He lit a fire, the flames slowly pushing back the dark. Their faces came into view one at a time. A black-haired woman with sharp, defiant eyes, even in her half-conscious state. A redhead with cracked lips and an unbroken posture. A blonde, frail but graceful, her face still soft despite the torment. Another, her eyes dark as night, silent but watchful. And finally, one older, chestnut hair streaked with gray, her presence calm and steady like she'd been holding the others together. Jack didn't need to ask questions. He already understood. They hadn't been chosen at random. Morrison wanted him to see this, to feel it, to know what kind of man he was up against. The wind rattled the walls, carrying the faint trace of rope and smoke. Jack sat with his back to the door, his rifle laid across his lap, the firelight flickering in his tired gray eyes. Memories of war pressed against him, blood, screams, battles he had sworn to leave behind. But his uncle had always told him, land isn't bought with money. It's held with blood. Now those words weighed heavier than ever. 5 broken women lying behind him, their lives tied to his choice. If he saved them, he would have to face the kind of men who hung women like cattle at a gate. If he walked away, he'd stop being a man altogether. A groan stirred the silence. The black-haired woman forced her eyes open, the bruise around her neck deep and angry. Her voice rasped but carried the steel of command. "Don't leave us." Jack bent down, lifting his canteen to her lips. She drank greedily, every swallow pulling her back from the edge. Her breathing steadied. She sat up slowly, her eyes cutting into him like knives. "Do you understand what you've walked into?" Before he could answer, more sounds filled the cabin. The redhead pushed herself upright, fury sparking in her blue eyes. The blonde clung to Jack's shirt like a drowning child to driftwood. The older woman moved with calm precision, helping the others, her presence steady and sure. They were battered, scarred, but alive. Jack shared water, tore pieces of bread, watched them test him with their eyes. At last, the older one spoke for them all, her voice firm. We didn't hang ourselves. That was Morrison's doing. He runs his place now. Anyone who sets foot here pays in blood. Jack clenched his jaw, anger tightening every muscle. The redhead let out a bitter laugh. If you got any sense, you'll get back on your horse and ride away. We're already as good as dead. If you stay, you'll join us. Jack's voice came low, steady. I cut those ropes. That means your fate's tied to mine. The black-haired woman leaned forward, a weary but defiant smile tugging at her lips. Then listen close, landowner. You didn't just inherit a cabin. You inherited a war. Jack didn't argue. He didn't need to. The firelight flickered against his weathered face as he stared into the dark, knowing deep down she was right. Whatever peace he'd dreamed of was gone. The storm had already begun. Jack stayed awake most of that night, the fire snapping and groaning in the hearth. The women lay stretched across the cabin floor, their chests rising and falling unevenly, breaths rough like they had been dragged back from death. He could hear every sound, a cough, a shiver, a muffled groan, and with each one came the reminder that he had tied himself to them the moment his knife sliced through that first rope. He poured water carefully into the cracked lips of the redhead, Kate, who kept swatting his hand away until she finally gave in, drinking as if swallowing fire. I don't need your pity, she muttered, voice hoarse but still edged with fight. This isn't pity, Jack said softly. It's survival. The blonde girl, Lily, stirred at the sound, clutching a scarf like it was the only piece of her left that mattered. She whispered, barely louder than the fire. He accused my father of stealing horses. He didn't, but he hanged himself after they took me. I've got no home now. Her words broke off, and Jack saw how her fingers shook even as she tried to hide it. The older woman, Margaret, touched Lily's shoulder, steadying her like she had done 100 times before. Breathe, she told her. You're still here. That's enough for tonight. Jack's chest tightened. He had seen soldiers broken in battle, but there was something different about this. War was one kind of cruelty. What Morrison had done was worse. It was personal, deliberate, and dressed up to look like justice. From the other side of the fire, the quietest one, Emma, finally spoke. She slid a small leather pouch across the floor toward him. Jack opened it and saw forged papers, land deeds, contracts stamped with seals. This is what he wanted to bury with us, she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. Proof. Every lie, every theft. He thought the ropes would silence us. He didn't count on you cutting us down. Jack ran his thumb across the papers, his stomach twisting. Morrison wasn't just a bully or a greedy landowner. He was a judge, a man who wore the robe of law but twisted it into a weapon. Jack remembered his uncle's words again. Land cost blood, but now he understood it cost more than that. It cost truth, and truth was the one thing Morrison couldn't allow. Sarah, the black-haired woman, lifted her head from where she had been resting. Her green eyes burned in the firelight, rope marks raw around her neck. You thought you came here for land, Jack. You didn't. You came here to stand in the middle of a battlefield, and you don't get to be a bystander anymore. Not after cutting those ropes. Jack didn't answer. He dropped another log into the fire, watching the sparks leap upward, trying to drown out the pounding of his own heartbeat. He had hoped for a quiet life, but peace had never belonged to him. Maybe it never did. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boards of the cabin. For a while, no one spoke. The only sounds were the fire and the soft breaths of the women, clinging to whatever strength they had left. Then Kate broke the silence, her voice sharp but trembling underneath. If you've got any sense at all, you'll take your horse and ride out before dawn. You don't owe us anything. Morrison will kill you just like he tried to kill us. Jack leaned forward, his eyes on the fire. His voice was low but steady. I made my choice when I cut you down. If Morrison wants to finish what he started, he'll have to go through me. For the first time since he'd met her, Sarah let the faintest smile curve across her lips. Then you'd better understand something. This isn't just about you or us. It's about every soul he's crushed under his boot. You cut us free, Jack. That means you've chosen your side. Jack looked around the cabin, at the faces flickering in firelight. Broken, scarred, but unbowed. And he realized then that it wasn't just his land on the line anymore. It was justice. It was dignity. And once you stepped into a fight like that, there was no walking away. The fire burned low, the night outside colder than ever. Jack sat with his rifle across his knees, his body aching, but his mind alive with the weight of what was coming. Peace was gone, but something else had taken its place. A grim resolve, a duty he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The cabin grew quiet toward dawn, the fire nothing more than glowing coals, the air thick with smoke and exhaustion. Jack sat slumped against the doorframe, too alert to rest, listening to every creak and breath. When the first gray light broke through the cracks in the wall, he stepped outside, rubbing at the ache in his shoulders. A heavy fog had rolled into the valley, swallowing the horizon. For a brief, fragile moment, it almost felt like peace. He poured steaming coffee into a tin cup, the warmth cutting through the cold that had clung to him since he first saw those ropes. The cabin behind him held the soft sounds of breathing. 5 women who'd barely survived the night. 5 lives now tied to his. Jack didn't fool himself into thinking this calm would last. He'd been a soldier too long to believe in that kind of mercy. Then came the sound he dreaded. Hoofbeats. At first scattered, muffled in the fog. Then faster, harder, echoing like drums. Jack set the cup down and reached for his rifle. His eyes narrowed toward the ridge where the red clay trail cut down into the valley. Shadows began to form in the mist. 3 riders appeared first, their horses black as coal. They stopped on the rise, silent as executioners. The man in the middle sat tall in the saddle, his long coat draped across broad shoulders. Even from a distance, Jack could see the easy way his hand rested on the grip of his revolver, like he'd done it 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 more without a second thought. Behind Jack, the door creaked open. Sarah stepped out, her black hair messy, rope burns still raw against her neck. She looked toward the ridge, her voice dropping into a whisper colder than the morning fog. "It's him, Morrison. He knows we lived." Kate rushed to the window, her face twisted with fury. "I knew he wouldn't let us go. He's come to finish what he started." Lily clung tighter to Margaret's hand inside, trembling like she was still tied to that rope. Emma didn't move, her dark eyes fixed on the ridge, hard as stone. Jack rose slowly, Winchester in hand, his expression unreadable but his stance leaving no doubt. He didn't need to say anything. His choice had already been made. The hoofbeats came again. Not 3 this time. More. Many more. Out of the tree-line they came, one after another, until the ridge seemed to crawl with men on horseback. Torches flared in the fog, glowing like hungry eyes. They spread out in a wide arc, surrounding the valley, circling the cabin like wolves who'd finally found cornered prey. Margaret's hand gripped Jack's arm, her voice trembling but firm. "You still have a way out. We don't. If you leave now, you might live." Jack shook his head slow and steady. His hand slid along the worn stock of his rifle. His voice came out low, gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who'd already made peace with danger. "I gave up that chance the moment I cut you down. This land is mine now, and it's not just dirt anymore. It's our stronghold." Sarah's eyes flashed, her body leaning close to him, her voice sharp as steel. "Then you should hold this." She pressed a worn dagger into his palm, its blade dulled with age but still deadly. "If you're going to stand with us, you need to understand. This isn't inheritance anymore. This is war." A hoarse scream from the ridge, a wild, violent sound that shattered the morning stillness. The fog began to lift, revealing more of them. Morrison's gang, faces twisted with greed and cruelty, torches burning in their fists. The earth trembled beneath the pounding of hooves as they began their descent. The cabin that had once been nothing more than his uncle's legacy now felt like a fortress. Every board, every nail, every breath inside it braced for the firestorm about to come. Jack gripped the dagger tight, the weight of it both heavy and grounding. He had thought he'd been given a piece of land. Instead, he'd been given a war. Night would fall before long, and with it, fire and blood. But in that moment, With the fog curling low and the sound of Morrison's riders closing in, Jack knew one thing. There was no more running, no more searching for peace. He was exactly where he was meant to stand. Night came quicker than Jack expected, the valley swallowed whole by shadows. The only light outside was the restless flicker of torches clutched by Morrison's men. Their laughter carried on the cold wind, sharp and cruel, like jackals circling a wounded animal. Horses stomped and snorted, the earth trembling beneath their weight, as if they already tasted blood. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension and smoke from the fire. Jack sat at the table, his Winchester laid out in front of him, rounds clicking one by one as he checked the chamber. Each metallic snap echoed too loudly in the tight room, making the women flinch, though none of them complained. They were too focused on what lay outside. Kate broke the silence first, her hands trembling as she loaded an old Colt Jack had given her. She tried to mask her fear with bitterness, but her voice cracked anyway. I should have burned his house down myself the night he took my sister. Now look at us, waiting in a wooden box for wolves to break down the door. Kate, Margaret said softly, her tone carrying more weight than a shout. She was sitting near Lily, brushing back the younger girl's tangled blonde hair, trying to calm her shaking. Don't waste your strength on anger. You'll need it for survival. Kate slammed the cylinder shut and glared across the firelight. Don't you tell me how to feel, Margaret. Anger is the only thing keeping me standing. Jack looked at her, not with judgment, but with something heavier, recognition. He knew that kind of anger. He'd lived off it in the war, letting it push him forward when everything inside him wanted to quit. He leaned forward, his voice low, even. Hold on to it, then. Just don't let it blind you. Anger wins battles, but focus keeps you alive. Emma moved quietly in the corner, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. She pulled a hunting knife from her boot, slipping it into the sleeve of her dress. When Jack noticed, she gave the faintest shrug. Sometimes silence cuts deeper than bullets. Sarah stood near the window, pistol in hand, her jaw set tight. She hadn't spoken in a while, but when she finally did, her words were sharp enough to slice through the thick air. Morrison doesn't just want this land. He wants to make sure no one can ever challenge him again. That's why he put us on those ropes. She turned, meeting Jack's eyes. When you cut us down, you weren't saving lives. You were declaring war on him. Jack didn't look away. Then it's a war I'll finish. The words hung heavy, neither promise nor threat, just plain truth. A sudden gunshot cracked outside, the sound so close the walls shuddered. Lily screamed and dropped the cup she was holding. It shattered across the floor. Jack moved fast, crouching down to her, his voice steady even though his own heart was pounding. Hey, look at me. Breathe. You're not on that rope anymore. You're here, inside, with us. You're safe until we say otherwise. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, clutching his sleeve like a child. Jack squeezed her hand once before standing. The next moment, Morrison's voice boomed from outside, carried by the cold wind. Ward, you think you saved them? All you did was write your own death sentence. That cabin don't belong to you. It belongs to me. Everything here does. Jack stepped to the door, rifle in his hands, his voice rough but steady as stone. This land belonged to Jeremiah Ward, and now it belongs to me. If you want it, you'll have to walk through hell to take it. Before his words had even faded, another shot rang out, splintering wood near the gate. Then came the charge. Hooves thundered, men shouted, bullets ripped into the walls. The cabin erupted into chaos. Kate was the first to fire, the Colt exploding in her hands as she screamed through gritted teeth, hitting a man who tried to scramble onto the porch. Lily trembled, eyes shut tight, but when Jack shouted, "Now!" she pulled the trigger of the shotgun. The blast shook the room, throwing two riders back into the dirt. Emma moved like a shadow. She waited for one to climb through the shattered window, then struck without a word, her knife flashing across his throat. He dropped soundless to the floor, his blood mixing with the dirt. Margaret yanked Lily back, then grabbed a jar of kerosene, lit it, and hurled it through the broken window. Flames roared to life outside, the blaze forcing Morrison's men to scatter. Horses screamed, their silhouettes twisting in the firelight. Through the gun smoke, Jack worked the lever of his Winchester, calm and methodical. One shot, one rider falling. Another shot, another cry silenced. His eyes burned in the firelight, steady as if he'd been born for this moment. Sarah slid beside him, firing 2 quick shots, her green eyes fierce as the flames reflected in them. Together they held the door while the others reloaded, their breaths ragged but unbroken. The night outside became a storm of screams, bullets, and fire. The cabin shook with the fury of it. The smell of gunpowder thick in the air, but no one inside faltered. What had once been a simple home was now a fortress, and every person inside it had chosen to stand rather than fall. For Jack, there was no longer any thought of peace, no dream of quiet mornings on inherited land. There was only this blood, smoke, and the unyielding choice to fight beside the 5 women whose ropes he had cut. Gunfire tore through the night. The cabin walls shook with every shot, boards splintering, glass falling from the windows. Smoke stung their eyes, and the smell of gunpowder burned in their lungs. Jack's ears rang from the constant roar of guns, but he kept his focus. Each time he worked the lever of the Winchester, another man fell. He moved with calm, steady hands, the way a soldier does when there's no room left for fear. Kate crouched by the window, teeth clenched, her red hair stuck to her face with sweat. She fired again and again, yelling with every shot, not just from rage but from pain she'd carried too long. "This is for my sister," she screamed as another rider dropped to the dirt. Beside her, Lily was shaking, her hands clumsy on the shotgun. Her face was pale, her body trembling so badly she could barely aim. Margaret knelt behind her, guiding her arms. "Breathe, child. Just breathe. Steady. You're stronger than you think." Lily pulled the trigger, the blast throwing her backward, but 2 men outside went down hard. She gasped, her whole body trembling, but Margaret held her steady. "See? You can fight. You're still here." Emma stayed quiet, hidden in the dark corner of the cabin. When a man burst through the half-broken door, she moved like a shadow. Her knife flashed, quick and sure. He gurgled and dropped at her feet. She wiped the blade on his coat without a word, her dark eyes colder than the night. Sarah fought right beside Jack. Her pistol cracked in sharp rhythm with his rifle, her green eyes glowing in the firelight. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. When Jack's shoulder grazed hers in the chaos, she gave him a quick look, half a smile, half defiance. "You're not fighting this alone," she shouted over the roar. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The 2 of them stood like stone, side by side, pouring lead into the wave of men outside. Morrison's voice rose above the noise, cold and certain. "You think you can win? You're only delaying the noose. Hand them over, Ward. That cabin won't stand." Jack leaned into the doorframe and fired another round before shouting back. "You'll have to walk through my grave first." The fight went on, a storm of screaming horses, breaking glass, and bullets smashing into wood. Grace's jar of fire still burned bright outside, throwing wild light across the yard. The flames scared the horses, slowed the charge, but Morrison's men kept coming. Inside, their strength was fading. Kate's hands shook as she reloaded, her breathing ragged. Lily's arms felt like stone after every shot, tears streaking her dirty face. Margaret's voice stayed steady, but even she trembled when bullets ripped holes through the walls inches from her head. Emma moved slower now, her knife hand slick with blood. Sarah's jaw clenched tight, her lips pressed into a line, but she never lowered her gun. Jack could feel his body wearing down too. His shoulder burned where a bullet had grazed him, and the ache of war returned to his bones. But he pushed through it because stopping wasn't an option. He cut those ropes, and with that choice came the weight of every life in this cabin. The noise finally began to change. Shouts turned to screams. Horses cried out in panic. The gunfire thinned. Jack reloaded one last time and fired into the smoke. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of fire outside and the harsh breathing of the 6 people inside. The yard was littered with bodies, both men and horses. Flames from the spilled kerosene painted the dirt red and orange, shadows jumping on the walls of the cabin. The smell of blood and smoke was heavy in the air, almost too much to breathe. Then, through the haze, Morrison appeared. He walked slowly, calmly, his long black coat swaying, a revolver shining in his hand. His face was like carved stone, cold and merciless, his eyes locked on the cabin. He stopped just a few yards away and raised his voice. "Ward, you didn't save them. You only dug yourself a deeper grave. Around here, the law is what I say it is, and my law doesn't leave room for you." Jack pushed himself to his feet, blood running down his arm. He stood on the porch, Winchester heavy in his grip. Behind him, the women rose one by one, their faces pale, their bodies weak, but their eyes fierce. None of them would let him stand alone. Sarah stepped forward, holding a bundle of papers she had hidden in her coat. Her voice rang clear and sharp. "You call yourself law? This is the truth. Fake debts, forged papers, every name you've bought and paid for. We have it all." Morrison sneered, lifting his revolver. "Paper doesn't stop bullets." Emma moved out of the shadows then, holding a silver locket in her hand, its surface catching the firelight. Her voice was soft but steady. "Do you remember this? It belonged to Margaret, your wife. She's alive, and she told us everything. How you faked her death, how you stole her father's gold mine, how every woman who stood against you disappeared." For the first time, Morrison's face shifted. His sneer faltered, his eyes flashing with something sharp and ugly. Fear. The fire outside snapped and hissed as the night pressed close around the cabin. Morrison stood only yards away, his coat brushing the dirt, his revolver steady in his hand. For a moment, time seemed to stop. No gunshots, no screams, just the sound of flames crackling and the low, ragged breathing of everyone still alive. Emma's words still hung in the air like a knife. Morrison's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering from the silver locket in her hand back to her face. His sneer returned, but it looked thinner now, forced. "Lies," he barked, his voice sharp. "Margaret died 5 years ago. You can't twist me with stories." Margaret, the older woman, pushed herself forward then, her eyes firm and her voice cutting like steel. "We met her 3 weeks ago in Denver. She's alive. She gave us a sworn statement, and the marshal has it." She held Morrison's stare without a flinch. "There's nowhere left for you to run." For the first time, Morrison hesitated. His revolver wavered just slightly, enough for Jack to notice. Jack felt the shift, that tiny crack in the armor of a man who had ruled this valley with fear. But just as quickly, fury flooded back into Morrison's face. He raised his pistol, aiming straight at Sarah. Everything happened in a blur. Jack didn't think, didn't weigh options. He shoved Sarah aside, raised his Winchester, and fired. The blast split the night, echoing across the valley like thunder. Morrison staggered back, his gun flying from his hand, a scream ripping from his throat as the bullet tore into his shoulder. "Now!" Kate cried, her voice shaking with rage. She stormed past Jack, Colt in hand, eyes blazing. "This is for everything you stole, you bastard." She pressed the barrel toward him, but Jack caught her wrist, holding her back. Her whole body shook with fury, tears spilling down her face. "Let me finish it. Let me end him." "No," Jack said, his voice steady, his hand strong around hers. "Not like this. He doesn't get to die quick. He answers to the law he twisted." Morrison collapsed to his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted with pain and hate. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You think the law cares about you? I am the law. Without me, this town dies." Sarah stood tall beside Jack now, her voice low but sharp as glass. "You're not the law, Morrison. You're just a man who thought fear could last forever. But fear breaks. Tonight, it breaks with you." The sound of horses drifted across the valley, faint at first, then stronger, coming fast. The women froze, exchanging quick looks. Jack raised his rifle again, bracing himself, but then the torches appeared. Not Morrison's men this time, but riders with badges glinting in the moonlight. The marshal's posse. Morrison's eyes widened, his breath catching in his chest. For the first time, he looked small, cornered. The lawmen rode into the yard, their guns drawn, their faces hard. One of them, a silver-bearded marshal with eyes like sharpened steel, dismounted and strode forward. He took in the scene, the bodies, the fire, the man kneeling in the dirt. His gaze shifted to Jack, then to the 5 women standing behind him, their faces marked with rope burns, blood, and firelight. "You did what no court dared," the marshal said, his voice heavy with respect. He looked down at Morrison, whose face was pale and twisted with helpless rage. "This man will stand trial. And for once, justice will not wear his chains." Morrison roared, trying to lunge, but the lawmen dragged him down, binding his hands tight. His shouts broke against the cold night air. "They'll hang before I do. You'll all." His words choked off as a fist silenced him. Kate stood shaking, her gun still clenched tight, her chest heaving. Jack gently pushed the weapon down, his voice soft but firm. "It's over, Kate. He's done. Let him live with what he can't control anymore." The fire crackled, sparks snapping into the black sky. Sarah stepped close to Jack, her voice quiet enough only he could hear. "You saved us. But you should know, Jack, you didn't just save 5 women tonight. You saved every voice he tried to silence." Jack looked at her, his silver-gray eyes weary but steady. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just nodded, lowering his rifle as the marshal's men hauled Morrison away into the dark. The valley grew quiet again, except for the hiss of flames and the distant sound of horses fading into the night. For the first time since he'd arrived, Jack could breathe without expecting the next shot. But the smell of smoke and blood clung to him, a reminder of what it had taken to get here. Behind him, the cabin still stood, scarred and broken, but standing. And inside it, 5 women who had been left for dead were alive, stronger than before. Jack knew the war wasn't fully over. Morrison's power reached far. But tonight, one truth stood tall in the valley. Fear had been broken. The night faded slowly, and by morning the valley carried a different kind of silence. Smoke still rose from the burned patches of earth where Grace's fire had caught, and the ground was littered with broken wood, shattered glass, and the dark stains of blood. Morrison was gone, tied and dragged away by the marshal's men, but the weight of what had happened clung to the cabin like a shadow. Inside, Jack sat on a chair near the fire, his shirt torn at the shoulder where blood had soaked through the fabric. Margaret worked quietly beside him, her hands steady as she cleaned and wrapped the wound. She said nothing, and neither did he, but the silence wasn't empty. It carried understanding, the kind that comes after too much has been lost and too much has been seen. Lily knelt near the hearth, trying to relight the fire. Her hand shook so badly she dropped the flint more than once. Finally, Kate crouched beside her, her own hands rough and clumsy, but stronger. Together they struck until the spark caught, flames rising again. Lily gave a shaky smile, tears in her eyes. Kate brushed them away roughly with her thumb. "You're not broken. Don't let him take more from you than he already has." Emma sat by the window, staring out at the valley where the fog was beginning to lift. She hadn't spoken since the marshal left, and her knife still rested in her lap, blade clean but not forgotten. Sarah came over and stood beside her, leaning against the wall. "You don't have to carry the silence alone," she said quietly. Emma only gave the smallest nod, her dark eyes still fixed on the horizon. Jack finally broke the stillness, his voice low but certain. "This isn't over. Morrison may be in chains, but men like him don't vanish overnight. He's built too many lies, bought too many souls. Someone will try to pick up where he left off." Sarah turned to him, her eyes sharp but tired. "Then we make sure they don't. We carry the truth, all of us, together." Jack looked at the 5 of them, women who should have been gone, who had been strung up as warnings, yet now stood taller than before. Broken in body maybe, but not in spirit. He felt a pull inside, not just of duty, but of something deeper, something he hadn't known he needed. That day, the cabin became more than shelter. They began to put it back together. Jack worked the hammer, his arms sore but steady, as he fixed the broken boards of the gate. Margaret stood by his side, handing him nails, her quiet presence steady as always. Kate took charge of the horses, her voice strong again as she led them across the yard. their hooves pounding life back into the dirt. Lily bent down in the small patch of earth out front, her hands in the soil as she replanted what had once been a garden. Her fingers were still frail, her movements shaky, but determination burned in her eyes. "If something can grow here again," she whispered, "then so can we." Emma sat at the table inside, spreading out papers, sorting them into neat piles. Forged deeds, fake contracts, letters stamped with stolen seals. Evidence of every crime Morrison had tried to bury. Her hands were quiet, precise, but her face carried the fire of someone who knew these papers were more dangerous than any bullet. And Sarah, she stayed close to Jack, working alongside him as he raised the broken walls. At sunset, they stood together on the porch, watching the valley glow red and gold. Her green eyes caught the last of the light, her face scarred but unbowed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she placed her hand gently on his. No words, just that. A gesture that told him what neither could yet say aloud. 3 days passed. The cabin began to look whole again, though the scars remained. At night, they sat by the fire, the 6 of them, sharing food and silence and the kind of glances that spoke louder than words. On the 3rd night, Jack finally spoke what had been sitting in his chest since that first morning. His voice was rough but steady. "Some ropes are meant to kill, but when you cut them, they can turn into ties that bind. I thought I was inheriting land. Truth is, I inherited all of you." No one answered. Only Sarah reached over, her hand resting on his once more, her eyes glowing in the firelight. And in that moment, Jack knew the cabin was no longer just his uncle's gift. It was theirs, a place born out of blood and ashes, rebuilt with trust and stubborn hope. The West was still wild, still cruel, but inside those walls, something stronger than fear had begun to take root. The moon hung high above the valley, silver light spilling across the rebuilt cabin. The nights had grown quieter since Morrison was dragged away, but the echoes of that storm still lived in the air. The smell of smoke in the wood, the scars etched deep in the dirt, and the memory of ropes swaying at the gate. Jack sat on the porch with his rifle resting against the wall, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Inside, he could hear the faint sounds of life returning. Margaret's calm voice guiding Lily as she learned to tend the garden. Kate's laughter, sharp but healing, drifting through as she argued with Sarah over who handled the horses better. Emma's steady shuffle of papers, her careful hands preparing the proof that would finally see Morrison's web of lies undone. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the air that once smelled only of blood and fear. Now, it carried something different. Smoke from the chimney, the faint sweetness of fresh soil, the sound of women who had survived speaking like they had a right to fill the world with their voices. Later, they gathered by the fire, all 6 of them, the flames throwing shadows against the walls that no longer felt like prison bars. Jack looked around at their faces. Scarred, bruised, tired, but alive. Alive in a way that no rope, no judge, no cruel man had been able to take from them. Kate leaned back, her blue eyes glinting in the firelight. "Never thought I'd see the day Morrison's face twisted in fear. I swear, that moment alone will carry me for years." Lily smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. "I never thought I'd see anything after that rope. But I did, because you cut me down." She looked at Jack, her eyes soft. "You gave me back my breath." Emma spoke next, her voice calm as always, but this time not cold. "We carry the truth now. You try to bury it, but we live to hold it in our hands. That's more powerful than any bullet." Margaret gave a quiet nod, her eyes meeting Jack's. "You saved us, yes. But more than that, you gave us a choice. To fight, to live, to stand." Sarah, who had been silent the longest, finally lifted her gaze. Her green eyes burned with something deeper than fire. "You thought you inherited land, Jack, but you inherited a family, and a fight that belongs to all of us." Jack looked into the fire, his hands rough and scarred, his voice low but strong. "Some ropes are made to kill, but if you have the courage to cut them, they can become the ties that hold people together. I thought I was alone when I rode into this valley. I thought peace was something you could claim with a deed. But peace doesn't live in dirt. It lives in people, in trust, in the choice to stand when others fall. The fire crackled. No one argued. No one needed to. They had all lived the truth of his words. Outside, the valley stretched wide and silent, no longer owned by fear. The cabin stood beneath the stars, not just as shelter, but as proof that even in the darkest corners of the West, justice could take root, families could form out of ashes, and broken lives could stitch themselves back together. Jack leaned back, Sarah's hand resting on his, the others close by. For the first time in years, his chest felt light. Not because the fight was over, he knew battles would always come, but because he was no longer facing them alone. And so the land was no longer just inheritance. It was rebirth. It was trust. It was a promise. In the West, land could change hands, guns could trade owners, and fear could hold towns hostage. But justice, Jack knew now, belonged to those who refused to turn their backs on one another. That was the lesson he had learned in Blood and Fire. Sometimes the most valuable thing you inherit isn't land, or gold, or a cabin in the hills. It's the chance to become better than the world around you. The cabin glowed warm against the cold night, no longer a symbol of Morrison's cruelty, but a fortress built by 6 souls who had chosen to stand together. And out here in the wild silence of the West, that was enough.